probably the most important and also the most difficult part of designing and implementing KPIs that really work. And by work, I mean deliver the results, deliver the improvement, deliver the strategic outcomes that you're looking for your organization. Now, there is a lot of dry academic material out there on engagement and change management. And my experience is an awful lot of it may work, but it's complex, it's bureaucratic, and it's not particularly focused on real human behavior. So we're going to take a slightly different approach this week, and I'm going to walk you through a series of stories based on my own practical experience of generally not getting KPI buy-in and the lessons that we can draw from those problems that I've had. And I will boil that down to a handful of practical tips on how to approach it. Now, there are tools, there are methods that are extremely useful. And what I will share with you at the end is some information on how to go deeper into the particular topic, how to get some really rich practical advice, some checklists, and to really sort of sharpen the toolkit when it comes to engagement. But the principles I'm going to outline in the next 40 or so minutes will set you in really good stead, and I'm hoping that the horror stories I share with you will stick in your memory and be there when you encounter some of these challenges. So just to recap, I'm going to share some real world stories, give you some tips and advice, and then give you some pointers for how to get deeper resources, go into more detail than this. Now, if you stick around to the end, I am going to share a link which will give you a rich source of material. I'm also going to give you an exclusive VIP discount code for the KPI Black Belt, which is the best way to learn about these tools and techniques in real depth, and also to get practical hands-on experience and feedback from myself through tutorials. So if you stick around to the end, I'm going to share that with you and explain how you can take advantage of that $600 discount that I'm going to offer. So for those of you who've not met me before, I'm Bernie Smith, founder of Measure KPIs. My mission is to make KPIs simpler, easier to understand, and to make the process of choosing and implementing KPIs reliable and practical, and not some kind of guesswork or stressful exercise that it often ends up being in many organizations. The heart of everything I do is a method I developed in 2011 called the Results Orientated KPI System. Terrible name, so we shorten that to the ROCKS method. Now I'm going to touch briefly on the ROCKS method and explain where engagement fits within that, but today's session is not about explaining the ROCKS method in any detail beyond the engagement side. For credibility, just so you know, all of these organizations use the ROCKS method in some shape or form, so you can see it's been battle tested. It's been used in lots of different places, and it works. So the ROCKS method is a 7-step process. Most of those steps are around choosing your KPIs, designing dashboards. However, in recognition of how important engagement is, there's actually 2 steps around engagement. Step 2, immediately after we've decided what it is we're going to do, so once we've set our strategic objectives, it's about engaging the team. It's about getting the right people in the room as early as possible to start building that buy-in, to get their participation, their genuine input. And then step 7, going live, a very large part of that is how do we get the wider team fully engaged in what we're trying to do and genuinely passionate about it. And that brings me on to the first story that I'd like to share. Now, those of you who've seen one of my ROCKS talks before may have heard this story before, but for me, this is the gold standard of what we are trying to achieve when we implement our KPI system, or in fact, when we implement any kind of change. Now, this picture, it's a stock image, but this is what a friend of mine saw. So many years ago, I was an improvement consultant, and on a Monday morning, my job was to drive to a manufacturing site somewhere in the UK or Europe to help a team of people within that manufacturing business improve their operational performance, run faster, better, cheaper, make fewer mistakes, reduce cost, or make more profit. And that involved working closely with a team of often technicians, operatives from the process, perhaps some specialists, maybe some middle managers as well. Now, my friend Kevin drove to a site early on a Monday morning, and he pulled into the car park at 7:30 in the morning, and he saw a site like this. And he realised that the manufacturing plant had caught fire overnight. The fire brigade were there, bringing the blaze under control. And because the car park was the gathering area for fire events, all of the team were out there. In fact, the whole manufacturing business were out there in the car park, gathered in their fire teams. And he could see his team. They're in their white overalls, covered in soot, looking quite dejected. So he walked over to talk with them. And the foreman, the supervisor from the group, walked towards him and said, "Kevin, you can see what's happened. It's a disaster. We've lost lines 2 and 3. Lines 4, 5 and 6 may be up and running, but we've got so much cleaning to do." And there was a real mood of dejection. Then there was a pause, and his head lifted, and he said, "But we managed to save the flip charts." And the team had gone back into the building and recovered the flip charts of the work that they've been doing on process improvement. Now, for me, when we talk about engagement, often people think about a lack of resistance. People aren't negative, they don't object. But actually what we should be aiming for with our KPIs and any other kind of change program is that level of passionate engagement where people deeply care about what we're doing. So our goal when we talk about engagement is to harness participation and ownership, to generate genuine passion in what we're trying to do. Now, again, if you've worked with me in the past or seen any of my training, I'm a big fan of reverse brainstorming. So working out what goes wrong and then going backwards from that to figure out what we need to do to make it go right. So there's a couple of very obvious issues that happen with KPI engagement. The first is alienation, and that often comes from being involved too late, although there are other reasons as well. And I'll give you an example of how alienation works from my own experience. So I've been working with a large engineering consulting firm for the head of one of the global regions, designing a dashboard. So we were designing an EMEA dashboard, and I've been working on it for a number of weeks, building a visual prototype. Now, I'd been through stakeholder management and identified the stakeholders, and I put out an invitation. In fact, my client put out an invitation for a review and approval session on the prototype that we had created. So I'm on the call, and it's an audio call. This is going back a bit, but people had the slides emailed to them, and I'd invited around 25 stakeholders, or that's what I thought would turn up. So I'm watching the number of people on the call. It's 15, 18, 20, 27, 29, 30, 32. And I had this terrible realization that I had missed out a large number of people who had an interest in this dashboard. And I kind of knew how it was going to go at that point. I started to present, and then someone goes, "Well, this is the first we've seen of this." And someone else says, "Well, we weren't involved in this." And I was dead in the water. I knew that I had lost these people. I'd basically not included the right stakeholders, so I'd created this alienation. It wasn't just too late, I'd completely missed them out. And I knew that there was a huge amount of repair work required to bring those people back on board, if indeed that was possible. So it's really important that we identify everyone who's involved. And these can be people who are involved in the production of data, in the consolidation and creation of dashboards. It could be people who are involved in the consumption of it, or it could be downstream stakeholders. It can be surprising how many stakeholders there are in an organization. So we need to be incredibly thorough, because it only takes one or two influential stakeholders to be offside as a result of not being included to completely derail the process. And when I say influential, I don't just mean senior. There are some people within each organisation who may not have a senior role, but do carry a lot of weight and impact with their peer group. So we need to be extraordinarily careful and thorough. Even if people don't decide to actually engage, at least they've been invited. So there are a number of tools that can help with this. You'll be familiar with tools like RACI, a RACI matrix, where we identify who is responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. That's one tool. There are other tools, and we do cover this in my book and in the Black Belt as well. But use those tools and use them thoroughly. Some of the biggest unforced errors I've made in my career have been where I've been aware that we should identify stakeholders, but have not done that properly. So our first tip is be very, very thorough in identifying who your stakeholders are and in communicating with them. Simply knowing who they are is part of the picture. You need to reach out to them. And again, in KPI Checklist, my first book, I talk about checklists for communication and engagement. Planning that process, managing it, and being thorough is extraordinarily important. So missing out stakeholders was one of my early pain points in my KPI career. The next one, and this is one that you may well have come across a number of times, is fear. And I saw a very good example of this when I was working in a large UK bank, one of the largest retail banks, and I was working for the business banking division. So within business banking, you have what they call relationship managers, who are effectively account managers / salesmen for the business banking products. And I was discussing KPIs with one of these relationship managers, and I noticed that every time I mentioned the word KPI, he physically reacted. He had a twitch, and it wasn't a pleasant reaction. You could see that the word itself induced fear. Now, interestingly, I'll come back to this in a moment, when I dug into it, there was a very specific reason for his fear. But there can be multiple causes of fear within an individual or within a group. So it could be fear of loss of job, it could be fear of punishment, it could be fear of poor performance being exposed, or it could be fear of poor management behaviours. There's lots of different reasons behind it. What I would suggest, though, is the most powerful way of addressing it is to talk to your stakeholders. Now, I generally do this in one-to-one semi-structured interviews. What do I mean by semi-structured? I mean, there is a plan, but it's not like a verbal checklist. So you'll ask people what they think of their current KPIs, what they think doesn't work so well, what they would like to happen with the KPIs. And normally one-on-one, if you start asking questions like this, people will start to tell you what their fears are, so you can actually think about mitigating them. There is one particular question which I find works brilliantly, and that is, if you had a magic wand, what would you change about your existing KPIs? And that normally opens the floodgates and brings out all kinds of issues and concerns to the fore. So it's a great way of understanding what people's fear are. In terms of communication, it's really important that we target people correctly, so they get relevant messaging. That will help cut through some of the noise. Empathy and putting yourself in the shoes of the audience is extremely important as well. If people tell you that they are concerned about losing their jobs because of KPIs or targets, then we need to listen to that and build that into our communications. So our communications become one of the ways in which we can mitigate fear. Senior sponsorship is very important. Honesty is super important. And if you think it's going to be a tough ride in terms of bringing in the change that KPIs will bring, talk to people one-on-one, not as a group. I've discovered that an angry mob is quite a scary thing when you're trying to bring change in. And to use a UK phrase, I've had a couple of good kickings, metaphorically, where an angry group has turned on me as an individual because the fear and the concerns haven't been addressed individually and haven't been prepared for properly. It may be that you don't have the answers to hand, and that's fine. But whatever the situation, we need to be very clear on why we are implementing KPIs and what the message is. Now, going back to the example I gave you in banking, why did this guy have a visceral physical reaction to the word KPIs? Well, the reason was that KPIs and targets were used interchangeably. So as soon as this guy heard the word KPI, he thought target, he thought sales target, and he had seen many of his friends fired because they had not achieved their sales targets. Now, this is an important distinction. A KPI is what you're going to measure. A target is the value that you should achieve. Now, in terms of implementing KPIs, it's important to get to the principle that actually we should be measuring sales, or we should be measuring returns, or whatever it is. That is a separate conversation to what you should be selling, how much Bob should be selling per week. Targets are always controversial, and we actually have a structured method for designing targets, which I talked about in my fourth book, Gamed. There are a number of ways in which targets can go wrong, so we deal with that separately. So my advice would be, if you're talking about fear of KPIs, deal with KPIs, so what we're going to measure, and targets, what we expect people to deliver in terms of performance, or more importantly, what we expect the process to deliver, because I don't really believe in targeting individuals. Deal with those separately. So choose the KPIs, implement the KPIs, build agreement that we should be measuring these important things, then have the conversation about targets as a separate conversation, and use a structured method like the Rocket DS method, which I talk about in Gamed, to set meaningful targets that are going to drive the right behaviors. So that's tip number 2. Now, for the next situation, we're going to go to a paper mill. So I was working in a paper mill in Wales. These are big, complex technical environments with millions of pounds or dollars worth of machinery. And they are high-paced environments. Generally, if you're working in production, there's a strong focus on meeting production orders and keeping the machine running. And I was involved in a project, and it was proving quite difficult to get people fully engaged with efficiency measures. They cared about how much they produced, but they weren't really interested in how that compared with how much they could produce. And I saw something interesting happen. Initially, it was very difficult to get the manager to review the figures in the morning meeting. It was almost impossible to get his supervisors to take an interest in the performance figures. But we persevered, and we discovered almost by accident that what happens is you need to develop the performance habit. And the performance habit comes from regular systematic review of the figures, whether or not people seem interested. And what I discovered was, over a few weeks, we went from indifference and people saying, well, I don't think that figure's right, through to the amazing situation, or the amazing transformation, where one of the supervisors and then several of the supervisors would come into the office, and instead of doing their usual routine, which was making a cup of tea and having a chat, the first thing they would do was go over to the performance board and see how the previous shift did and how that compared with their performance. And it wasn't because they were being held brutally accountable. They weren't being beaten up for not achieving the target. They simply cared. But what I discovered was it takes time to form the habit, and there are a few steps that we can take to make habit formation easier. So tip number 3 is use habit formation science to start to build the performance habit and to start to develop people's interests in how performance is going. It will not happen immediately, and you will often see resistance at the start, but that doesn't mean that people won't become interested. And when people start pulling the information, asking how we did, rather than ignoring the PDF report that drops into their inbox, that is when you have built the KPI habit, and that is the holy grail. Now, There's more material on my website about this, but there are some basic steps that we can do to encourage habit formation. Repetition is definitely important. We also need to have a trigger. Now, visual triggers are very good, so performance boards are great, even handwritten ones, because people will see the information up on the wall. It will trigger them to look at it. The other thing that we need to do is to remove barriers. So the harder it is for someone to access the information, the less likely the habit is to be formed. It all seems very obvious. However, there is a Dr. Fogg, F-O-G-G, who has developed a 3-step method around habit formation. So I would encourage you to go out there and look up the Fogg method for habit formation, because it really very simply outlines what's required to form a habit. Now, interestingly, the habit formation tips that you will find there also apply to things like data capture, because data capture and data review are both performance habits that need to be developed. So we've talked about fear, we've talked about targets versus KPIs and habit formation. My next story takes us to an aerospace business where they did a fantastic job. Being mostly engineers, they were quite difficult to engage at the start because they were quite skeptical. But once they'd engaged, they were extremely structured and thorough. And we went through the whole of the ROCS process, from strategy through to building KPI trees, shortlisting which KPIs were most important, coming up with clear, precise definitions, and their management information team then took the prototype dashboards and reports, built them as fully working reports. And I was so impressed. I thought, this is fantastic. This is a home run when it comes to applying the ROCS method in a textbook fashion. Now, they got up and running, they built the reports, and I checked in about a year later and nothing had happened. And what had happened was that the head of the information management team had gone on to bigger and better things using her newfound skills, and the replacement had no investment in all of the work that had happened previously. So he'd looked at it, gone, that's nice, and completely ignored it. And I call this entropy. So entropy is the tendency for everything to fall into a low level of disorder. And this is what we see happen with engagement and enthusiasm for any kind of change, but also specifically for KPIs in any kind of an organization. Now, people will leave, they will be promoted, they will get fired, they will go off on maternity leave. So we need to plan for this, and there are certain things we can do. So we can document our processes, methodology, and thought process, although that alone will sit in a drawer. We also need to train champions. Now, I would say this, but training KPI black belts is a really good way of training champions, because they end up with the full toolkit, the full soup to nuts ability to go from strategy through to implemented KPIs. So a few strategically chosen and trained KPI black belts throughout the organization can be hugely powerful in maintaining the vision, the discipline, and the focus. We also need to properly engage and onboard executives when they come into the organization with what's happened previously. Now, that's a challenge because they always want to do things their own way. The key here is to show that the tools that we've got and that we can provide them with can help them achieve their goals. And the beauty of the ROCS method, KPI trees and so on, is they're principle-led. So you can flex them. So if there's a new agenda, a new set of targets or objectives, then we can flex the KPI tree, we can flex the reports and dashboards to show and to help drive them in that direction. Not easy, but we need a conscience and we need a police force when it comes to KPIs. So we need trained black belts and we need people who are responsible for keeping the candle burning. So tip number 4 is plan for engagement renewal. Expect people to leave, expect people to lose focus, be put on different projects, and make sure that we don't lose that initial drive and enthusiasm, and we keep things going. And companies like Toyota have done a fantastic job with the Toyota production system of creating a cultural momentum that goes beyond individuals and goes beyond initiatives. And that's really what we should be aiming for with our KPI sustainability as well. Now, my final thought, and this really comes back to the original point that I made, is you can do everything right. You can make fantastic progress. You can build beautiful KPI trees. You can do so well, and you can throw it all away. One slip up in terms of not engaging a senior stakeholder right at the start, one problem with someone leaving or meetings, no longer reviewing KPIs, and you can go all the way back to the start. And this is why I'm showing a snakes and ladders board. It can be a lot like snakes and ladders. You can get to square 98, you can hit a snake, and you can go all the way back to the start. So my advice would be, tip number 5, don't break the rules. It will haunt you later. And I've learned this the hard way. I've slackened off on stakeholder engagement. I've not put in place sustainability systems that really I knew should be there. And each time I've done that, it's bitten me. Now, with experience, I do it less often. So, I don't want to sell myself too short, but we all do it. We can all cut corners. And when it comes to cutting corners with engagement, the impact may not be clear now, but it will certainly become clear further down the line when we have invested lots of time and effort. So we have a lot more at stake. So the good news is that early engagement's baked into the ROCKS method, and it's not just the 2 engagement stages, step 2 and step 7, that build engagement. The methodology itself, the way we build KPI trees, is incredibly collaborative. It's a group-based activity. So for those of you who've not seen my KPI tree sessions, we get a team of about 8 to 12 stakeholders together to do the first draft of a KPI tree, but we always try and involve the wider stakeholder group. You can't physically build a KPI tree with more than about 12 people in the room, but what you can do is you can empower all of the workforce if you want to, and I have done this with organisations, all of the workforce, get them into a room, ask them, the day you had yesterday, was it good? Was it bad? Would these KPIs show that you've had a good or a bad day? Or have we missed something off this tree? You give them Post-its, you give them donuts and coffee, and you challenge them to break it to find problems to improve on it. And it works fabulously because you end up with a better KPI tree in this example, but they also feel ownership. They've seen it, they know it's coming, they've shaped it, they feel ownership. So every step of the method has engagement built in, but we have 2 distinct checkpoints, step 2 and step 7, where we think formally about how we manage that engagement as well. So I've thrown references to quite a few different tools in there. You can find a lot more materials on my website. So if you head to measurekpis.com, you will find these materials. But all of the things you need are on this link, kpi.contact. That has a link to the KPI Black Belt, which I'll talk about in a moment. It has a link to book a half-hour free chat with me. Always happy to talk, no commitment. There's the link to Made to Measure KPIs. There's also additional training and book links there as well. So you can check out my books and also go to KPI Academy. Now, if you want a low-cost option to explore this in more depth, then KPI Checklist is the way to go. For a few pounds on Amazon, you will get step-by-step instructions on engagement. You'll get free downloadable templates as well. It's also available in Spanish and German if those are your preferred languages. So that's a kind of do-it-yourself approach. If you really want to go deep on this, then the ROCKS KPI Black Belt is the way to go. So that is the premium offer, if you like. Head to kpiblackbelt.com and use this code before August the 6th, and you will get a $600 discount. This program is absolutely the best way to learn about the ROC system and to learn about the different modules that are all designed to fit together and work as a cohesive, comprehensive, integrated system. It's remote, it's spread over 14 weeks, it's modular, there's e-learning, there's assignments. I give video feedback on every single assignment, so on your specific assignment, and also we have weekly tutorials as well to keep everyone focused and on board. And I'm passionate this is the best way to learn about not just engagement, not just building KPI trees, but the whole toolkit, target and incentive design, index KPI design, using statistical methods, measuring the impossible. It's all in there, it's all documented, and it's all put together in a easily accessible, logical, structured way as well. So just to wrap up then, your gateway to all of these materials is kpi.contact. You can get to the black belt there, that's the first link. You can check out the books, you can go to Measure KPI for plenty of free materials. But whatever your KPI journey, all I would say is that engagement is the most important element. Getting people on board, getting them fired up, getting them enthusiastic and dealing with their concerns in an open and honest way is absolutely the foundation and key to success in any KPI implementation. So thank you for sticking around to the end. It's lovely to see you all. I see some familiar names in the attendee list here today. Any questions, just set up a call or drop me an email and keep in touch. Thanks everyone. Goodbye.